is the number to call. I want to grab a couple of sound bites while we're talking about the Second Amendment as we were at the end of that last segment. And again, just to close the loop on that, you know, Jesus said, if anybody strikes you on the right cheek, and the ESV correctly translates that, slaps you. If somebody's slapping you on the right cheek, you think about that. You're standing in front of them. They're right-handed, as most people were. That's what Jesus is talking about. And that person strikes you on the right cheek. What do they have to do? They've got to use the back of their hand. It's a slap. It's not a punch. It's done with the back of the hand, not with a closed fist. It's not assault and battery. It's an insult. And Jesus says, look, if you're in that situation, somebody insults you, do not respond in kind. That's not how God's people work. They don't trade insult for insult. Not talking about a prohibition against defending yourself against an all-out assault. Now, President Obama does not have an understanding about the Second Amendment. He's out of phase with the American people. We saw yesterday 65% of the American people believe that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect us against tyranny. So President Obama is in a distinct minority here, but he believes somehow, and I think he's mistaken on this, he believes that the Second Amendment, or that gun control, which is really people control, that somehow that is going to be a winning issue for the president in this next term of office, and he apparently is determined to try to push that through, whether the American people are with him on this or not. Now, here's Senator Ted Cruz, clip 12. Amy sitting in for Rob today. Here is Senator Ted Cruz talking about President Obama pushing this. And remember, Harry Reid doesn't want anything to do with gun control or people control. I got a column by Thomas Sowell here. It doesn't even work. We know that from the facts. More guns do equal less crime. You know, and Sowell's point is, look, all the people that are talking about banning guns have no idea what they're talking about. They've never fired a gun in their lives at a still target or a moving target. They don't know anything about high-capacity magazines. You know, and he's saying, look, somebody breaks into your house and 3 guys are in the posse that break into your house. You might be glad that you've got a high-capacity magazine with 30 rounds in it. You know, we saw that woman in the crawl space in Georgia. She emptied her gun into that guy. I think it was 5 shots or 6. I forget which, but she was out of bullets, and the guy was still alive. What if he'd had 2 guys with him? She had 2 kids with her. So Sowell's point is, look, in a situation like that, you might be glad. You know, Glock makes a pistol, has got a magazine that holds 17 rounds. You might be glad that you've got a semi-automatic weapon with 17 rounds in it to defend yourself and your family. But anyway, so realize that President Obama is going to have to do this by executive order. He's not going to get cooperation from the Senate. You've got 7 Democrats in the Senate. They're up for re-election next year. They do not want to vote. They don't want to vote for people control. They don't want to vote against the Second Amendment a year before they have to stand for re-election. They don't want to touch this thing. You've got 7 Democrats that are very vulnerable on this thing. This thing is not even going to get through the Senate. So what this means is that President Obama is going to have to go around Congress. He's going to have to go around the Constitution. He's going to have to go around the Second Amendment to enact these people control, gun control measures. Here is Senator Ted Cruz talking about President Obama.
Well, this is a president, I think, who has drunk the Kool-Aid. He is feeling right now high on his own power, and he is pushing on every front. On guns, you know, I think it's really sad to see the President of the United States exploiting the murder of children and using it to push his own extreme anti-gun agenda. I think what the President is proposing and the gun control proposals that are coming from Democrats in the Senate are, number 1, unconstitutional, and number 2, they don't work. They're bad policy.
So that's Ted Cruz. The president is kind of high on his own power, and that's, I think, what we're going to see, a showdown between President Obama and the Second Amendment, and maybe even between the members of his own party in the Senate. And there's no chance, 0 chance, anything like that's going to get through the House of Representatives. Nada, zip, 0. You know, elections have consequences. Elections have consequences, and the Republicans won the House of Representatives. Everybody talks like Obama's the only one that won an election. The Republicans won the election for the House of Representatives. That means they can stop any piece of bad legislation that Obama wants to sponsor. They can stop anything that that the Senate sends over if it's bad policy. President Obama can't spend $1 unless the House authorizes. So they've got all the leverage in the world when it comes to this debt ceiling debate. And by the way, they made a boo-boo on this. You might have heard what they're planning to do. They're going to kind of suspend the debt ceiling, say we're going to hold it in suspension until May 18, meaning you can go ahead and borrow money. They're not going to authorize borrowing, but they are authorizing it. To me, that's a Mickey Mouse deal. I do not like the way the Republicans are handling this. Everybody's talking about how brilliant this strategy is, and it's going to back Obama into corner. They are allowing the debt ceiling to be raised without raising the debt ceiling. This is Mickey Mouse to me. Not one thing about that I like. And further, they're saying, look, and this again sounds brilliant, the Senate's not going to get their paychecks unless they give us a budget. We're going to withhold their pay. Well, they're going to put it in an escrow account, but they are changing the terms of compensation for the Senate unless the Senate produces a budget. Now, again, that sounds kind of good because the Senate hasn't produced a budget in almost 1,400 days. And it's they've broken the law. The law says they got to propose a budget. They got to submit a budget every year. There's a deadline. They're blowing it off. They've missed it every year. And they're going to do it again. They haven't produced a budget in 1,400 days. And so the House is saying, look, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling until the Senate obeys the law and produces a budget. And unless you produce a budget, it's just got to be a good budget. Doesn't have to be a balanced budget. You just got to produce a budget. And if you don't, we're going to withhold your pay. The problem is that is flatly unconstitutional. You cannot do that. Now, they're saying, I'm sure they're dancing around us thinking, well, we're putting in an escrow account, so the money's going to be there. And if they give us a budget by May 18, we'll release the money. But here's what Amendment 27 says. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. In other words, you cannot vary the compensation. That's the phrase in the Constitution, varying the compensation. You can't do it until an election has intervened. In other words, you can vary the compensation for senators in the House, but it cannot take effect until there's another election. Now, obviously, the reason for this was to keep these guys from giving themselves a big fat raise. Fine. But that's not what it says. It says vary the compensation. You can't vary the compensation. So what the Republicans are proposing here is flatly unconstitutional. So, when people are out there saying, hey, I just climb on the Democrats and I just climb on Obama for doing unconstitutional things, if the Republicans do it, I'm going to call them on it. And they're doing two things here. They're doing two things that are unconstitutional. They are allowing the debt ceiling to be exceeded without authorization. That's wrong. That's bad. That's unconstitutional. You can't borrow money unless the House authorizes it, and they are not authorizing it. Ladies and gentlemen, that is bad policy. It's bad government, and it's unconstitutional. And they cannot vary the compensation of lawmakers between elections. You can't do it. So what they're proposing, I don't care about this escrow business. That's just a fig leaf. That's just smoke and mirrors. They are violating, I believe, the letter as well as the spirit of the Constitution. Now, here is, back to the Second Amendment. This is Senator Tim Kaine from New Jersey. And one of the things that's happened is that a lot of county sheriffs, even Texas Governor Rick Perry said this, Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant has said this, a lot of county sheriffs have said, look, if they pass some kind of gun control law, we're not going to enforce it in our county. It's null and void here. And the term that's used is nullification. And what this refers to is a policy that Thomas Jefferson actually authored, the icon of the left back in 1798 in what were called the Kentucky Resolutions. And the whole point of that, this is Thomas Jefferson saying, look, if the federal government passes a law that is unconstitutional, the states have no obligation to obey it. None, zip, nada, zero. If it's unconstitutional, the states do not have to obey it. Because remember, the states created the federal government, not the other way around. People think, well, the federal government creates the states, the federal government's in charge, the federal government's the boss, we got to do whatever the federal government says. Not so. The states, this is Thomas Jefferson's points, the states created the federal government. The states are the boss, the federal government is the servant. The states are the master, the federal government is the servant. The servant does what the state, what the boss, what the master tells it to do. So that nullification thing, that's not a code word for racism. It's not a code word for slavery. It is a Jeffersonian concept that goes back to the very founding principles of this country, that if it's not a right that's granted to Congress, it belongs to the states or to the people, respectively. Now, here is Senator Tim Kaine trying to argue that when you hear this talk about nullification, that's just a code word for slavery. That's just a code word for racism. Let's listen.
Presidents have the power to do executive orders. That's a power that's conferred on the president by Congress and by the Constitution.
Wrong.
And so there are those, and as Rand Paul said, he wants to nullify. Nullification is a code word. Look at when nullification has been used. It's been used a lot, it's a states' rights argument that gets used, in times of great controversy. But the president is acting by executive power that is legally conferred on him. And as you pointed out, you went over these executive orders. They are basic common sense things, mostly geared around information, sharing information with communities so that we can take the steps we need to reduce gun violence.
Right, but when you say nullify is a code word, usually there's some end game to the code. So what's being said?
We'll see what it is. But the notion that we're going to nullify presidential action when the president is acting pursuant to law, that's just kind of this anti-government rhetoric that I'm surprised to hear somebody in government use it.
So that's Tim Kaine. It's just a code word for racism, code word for slavery. Now, executive orders are a way for the president to exercise authority over the executive branch. The only people he can order around are people that work for him. He can't order you and me around. He has no authority to do that. He can't order us to do squat. Congress is the one that has all legislative power. It's in the Constitution. All legislative power is invested in Congress. Every bit. All. Not some of it to the president, some of it to all of it is invested in the Congress. He has no authority to order the American people to do anything. That resides wholly in the province of Congress. Focal Point, AFR Talk, back with your calls and more in 2.